Hey y'all, thanks for tuning in to the Peace Podcast, Season 3, Episode 9. Just give me boundaries, not punishment, whatever that looks like. And so I've been hearing a lot about people talking about setting boundaries and healthy boundaries and what good boundaries look like. And I've realized that a lot of the videos that we see on social media and a lot of the content that I've seen posted is not, in fact, talking about boundaries at all, but it's talking about a form of punishment. And so when I think about boundaries, I think about, when my little 7-year-old wants to go to the park. And so we're at the park and he's, wanting to do something like, let's say, jump off the swings and the ground is wet or there's like an obstruction there that's probably going to cause harm. I say to him, if you try that again, we're going to have to leave the park. That's a boundary. That's saying, I'm not willing to allow you to put yourself in a situation where you're going to get hurt. So I'm going to set a boundary that we can stay. But in order for us to stay, you have to prioritize your safety over what you think is fun. Now, if I was going to punish him, I might be like, we're leaving the park right now because you did something that I didn't want you to do, without ever communicating with him what the thing was, just expecting him to do what was in the best interest of himself and us at the park, so I don't have to run to the emergency room on a random Sunday. And the boundary is me saying, I'm going to let you play on those swings, but I'm going to put some parameters around it so that we can make sure to keep you safe and so that we can both enjoy the park. And I think that that's where we get the boundary conversation misconstrued, because we want to punish the other person for what we feel like they've either done to us or what we feel like they've been unwilling to do in the relationship. And when we do that, what happens is we foster this mindset of, I'm going to sit in my bitterness and make these rules around the relationship in my bitterness and then put the label of boundaries on them because I'm trying to protect myself. But that's not boundaries. Boundaries are punishment if they are used in such a way to take something away from somebody because we don't like their behavior or the way they spoke or whatever. Boundaries then become a punishment for us because now we're sitting in the bitterness of that conversation. Like, we're sitting in the bitterness of having to put that punishment on another person. So boundaries used as a form of punishment don't just punish the other person, they punish us as well. So what does it look like when we're actually setting the boundary and we're not using it as a form of punishment? It looks like saying, if I'm trying to save and sustain this relationship, what are some things that I need to happen in order to make that happen? So let's say you have a parent who is super overbearing and they feel like they're going to call you 7 times a day and text you and demand to know where you are and all of these things. You could be like, okay, my parent is overbearing, so every time she texts me something that is overbearing, I'm just going to ignore her, without ever communicating that you need that boundary. That's an unfair punishment for the behavior. And that might be to alleviate their own worry. And though having a parent who is worrisome can make you feel like they don't trust you or they are still treating you like a child because they're allowing you to navigate the world on your own, even though you've been doing it for quite some time. To them, they have anxiety around not being able to deal with the sadness that they would endure if something happened to you. And it is not your job, and the boundary is not an effort to fix that about them. Because even when you set a boundary, even when I with my child, it didn't change his adventure, like his sense of adventure. It didn't change the fact that he really wanted to jump off that swing. Me and our experience. So It was, I'm going to put some parameters around this so that I can still be in this situation with you. I can still be at this park with you. And the same thing is true of that relationship example. If you have a parent who's overbearing like that, you have to communicate the way that it makes you feel. Even if you don't think that's going to make them change their behavior, at least then you're heard. Sometimes they're not going to like that boundary setting. They're not even going to like the conversation. They're going to defend and deflect and all of these other things. But you have to communicate the way that it makes you feel first, and then make the boundary part of I want to still have a relationship with you, and I do not feel like you're entitled to know my whereabouts at all times because it makes me feel like a child and I'm no longer a. And when you communicate that, then you set the boundary. So you say, if you text me or if you call me and you demand to know my whereabouts, I'm going to tell you that I'm capable of keeping myself safe and I'm not going to give you that information. Now, this isn't in some type of defiance, like I'm not letting you know where I am. If it's a situation where you don't really care if they know where you are, then just tell them. But for the boundary setting, you just say, like, I'm not answering those text messages because of the way that it makes me feel. And I want to stay in a relationship with you, but I also want you to respect that I'm a whole adult. And, let's say you have a parent who is, negative things to say, or they're a gossiper and I'm using parent because my example was a parent, but I'll get into the the romantic relational parts in a second. But let's say you have a parent who's abusive or is gossipy or says really rude things. You're not saying, well, when they come to this party, I'm not talking to them, and then calling that a boundary. Maybe that's a future boundary, but initially with them, that again isn't a fair assessment of a boundary. It's just punishment for you not liking that characteristic about them. But what you might say, listen, when you talk negatively about people, or when you gossip about things, or when you say negative things to me that I feel like are abusive or offensive, it makes me feel, insert emotion here. It makes me feel uncomfortable. It makes me feel offended, or whatever it is. And then, so when those conversations happen, I'm going to exit the conversation. And I've had this talk in a different episode. But then if they do it, then you just say, I really don't want to be part of this conversation. Don't have this full-blown conversation about how they don't respect your boundaries and all of that. You just say, I'm going to exit the conversation, because again, the boundaries are to keep the relationship and sustain a healthy relationship. They're not to punish the other person and change their behavior, because change that parent is a gossip. You may never change that they speak negatively, but what you can do is change whether they do it to and with you or not willing to accept it, and so you put a boundary around it. Now let's talk about romantic relationship. So let's say you have a partner who consistently belittles you about the smallest mundane things. Then you can say, when you like that, it makes me feel like you don't really love me or value me, because that particular comment that you made is not something that I would ever even say to a friend, certainly not somebody that I love. So in the future, when you make those kind of comments, I'm going to place boundary around the thing. Now, I'm not saying that you should want to sustain that relationship, but I am saying that if you are trying to sustain that relationship, cold shoulder, stonewalling them, um, giving them the silent treatment and all of those things, they're not boundaries. Those are punishment. So because you didn't speak to me the way that I think I deserve to be treated, I'm going to punish you by not speaking to you at all. And it doesn't necessarily, and usually does not, fix the problem in and of itself. It just creates a situation where we've put a wall around ourselves to protect ourselves, but we're not actually fixing the problem. And so it rears its head again over and because that's what happens when we don't actually set a boundary and we give somebody a punishment treatment. If you have a partner who maybe is a little bit more flirtatious or personable with other people, and you don't really want to be in a relationship where you feel insecure about how the other person is speaking to other people, you can't just, okay, well, the next time they tell me a story where this happens, or the next time I see this happen, then I'm going to insert punishment here, because you haven't ever had the conversation. Maybe that person just thinks that's part of their personality and they don't even realize it's hurting you. So the first step to setting the boundary is to tell them, to communicate that. And you can tell a lot by the way that somebody responds to you telling them how something that they've done has hurt you. If they become defensive and they deflect, then they're not ready to hear they've done is wrong. And people like that have a hard time taking accountability and a hard time changing. But again, let's refer back to what I said earlier. Change. You're not setting the boundary to change them. You're setting the boundary to change you, to set parameters around what you're willing to accept, because you don't want to be in a relationship that's like that. So if you share that information with them, you tell them how you future, I would really like for you to do this, but if you're not going to do that, then here's what I'm going to do. Then it may be that you set the boundary and you say, in the future, like, if you do that, I'm going to have to reevaluate this relationship. And that too is a boundary. Now, there's a big difference between boundaries, ultimatums, and threats. Because when you're setting the boundary, remember, you're setting the boundary in an effort to stay. So I need you to do this in order for it to be safe enough for me to stay in this situation. When you give them an ultimatum, it's saying, if you don't do this, then I'm going to do something that's equally as hurtful to you, like leave or whatever it is. And that same thing is true of a threat. So there's a fine line between the two, but one is saying, I don't like your behavior, so I'm going to punish you. And the other one is saying, I don't like this behavior, so I'm going to set a boundary around this situation in order to sustain. And if you can't adhere to that boundary, if you can't respect that boundary, then there's going to have to be an even further consequence that's not a punishment, but is a cause and effect. So let's say, for instance, you have a parent who, doesn't reach out to you. You've told them time and time again your feelings, that they're not communicating with you or reaching out to you, and that they expect you to always be the one to reach out to them. And then they go around and say that you don't ever reach out to them or call them, but they're not realizing that the reason that you're not doing that is because you feel like the relationship should go both ways. If you've communicated that with them, if you said, it really hurts my feelings that you expect me to always reach out to you, and it doesn't make me feel like our relationship is full and whole if I'm the one who's always checking on you, because I would love to be checked on by you sometimes. And I've also heard that you're having conversations that are saying that I'm inattentive to you and I don't care about our relationship. Actually true. It's just me feeling like I'm doing all the heavy lifting and not feeling like that's getting reciprocated. And in order to sustain this relationship forward, I need to feel reciprocity inside of our relationship. So in the future, I would love for you to reach out to me, think about the fact that I should be reaching out to you, and perhaps we could create some sort of pattern where we're continuing this relationship. But if you continue to have these conversations in the future about me, then I'm probably not going to be more apt to reach out to you. So my boundary is going to be, if you don't reach out to me, but you're talking about me reaching out to you in a negative way, then when we have them, and not really prioritize this conversation between the two of us, because I feel like it's not going to be reciprocal. Conversation, you can say, it hurts me when I feel like I'm always reaching out to you, and I would really love for you to reach out to me just as much. You can even set a, it might not feel as authentic, but you can be like, every other week I'm going to reach out to this parent, and then hopefully every other week he's going to reach out to me. And if he doesn't reach out to me on that every other week, then I'm going to stop reaching out to him on the other times, or her on the other times, because this doesn't feel like a reciprocal relationship. You're not doing it to punish that person. You're not doing it to say, well, if you're not going to reach out to me, then I'm not going to reach out to you. You're doing it so that you don't feel negative in that space of, I'm not being considered. And it's not disrespectful to set a boundary with people. So if you can't really determine whether you're setting a boundary or whether you're using that boundary that you're quote unquote form of punishment, there are some things that you can ask yourself that will really help you to frame your brain around whether it's a boundary or whether it's a punishment. And the first one is it an effort to save or sustain the relationship? So if that boundary is in place, will you feel like that relationship can continue? If that boundary is in place, you feel like that person will have to pay for their actions by that boundary being enacted, then it's not a boundary, it's a punishment. It's only a boundary if you've put it into place as an effort to save the relationship. On boundary number 6 with this same behavior, then of course you're not doing this as an effort to sustain the relationship because you're on your way out of the relationship. Because sometimes boundaries lead to goodbyes, like Lisa TerKeurst says in her book. And if you haven't read, highly recommend it. It's an amazing book, especially if you're teetering on how to set boundaries with people or when to know to leave a situation. Initially, when you set boundaries, your effort should be in trying to sustain or save the relationship. If those boundaries aren't being respected, then you keep the boundary, but then you start to ask yourself if the relationship is worth saving and if it can actually be sustained. Hear me say ask yourself if it's an effort to save the relationship, and then say, well, I tried, it's not saving the relationship, so now the boundary is still there, but I'm thinking about leaving the relationship, so it isn't a boundary, it's punishment. That's not what I'm saying. But when you initially enact the boundary, your goal should be to save and sustain the relationship. Otherwise, you're using it as punishment. The second thing to ask yourself is, have I communicated this need? If you haven't even communicated the need, just like that example that I gave you about the park, if I didn't communicate what I to do to keep himself safe, then I absolutely can't expect for him to know that that's what I want him to do, because in a child's mind, he's just having fun. From that person's perspective, they might just be being them. But sometimes being them may look like, so even if their intentions are pure, it can still look like hurt on your end. And you can share that information, but you have to communicate it. Expect somebody to know, even if your behaviors should show it because you act a certain way when they do that, you have to explicitly communicate what you need, why you need it, what that behavior is doing to you, and what you're willing to do to maintain that boundary if it doesn't happen on their end. Leaving the conversation, not coming to the family gatherings, not answering the phone call or text, whatever it is, you have to be willing to do whatever that is on the other end, and you have to communicate that to them so that they know that you're not playing games. If this is what happens, then this is what I'm going to do. And every time it happens, it's what you do. So they're not going to be responsible for maintaining the boundary even if you communicate it with them. It's your boundary, you're going to have to maintain it. They are not always going to change their behavior. They're going to know that you're serious about the boundary. So don't have that expectation. And then the last one is, are you weaponizing the boundary in an effort to change the relationship? Because if that boundary is being used as a sword to punish them, used as a weapon to punish them, it will never sustain the relationship, because then it becomes tit for tat. Well, you did this to hurt me, now I'm going to back. So you have to ask yourself, if you're weaponizing the boundary, are you weaponizing the boundary to try to change the person or change the relationship? Because the reality is the relationship may never change. But enacting the boundary will change you. It will change how you feel. It will change how you're able to react and respond in that space. And it will change how you can be in that relationship. But if it's enacted to weaponize, then there's going to be bitterness and ugliness all inside of that relationship, because you're trying to change the person and force that to happen as an effort of manipulation. And that isn't a boundary, and it just won't work. So if you're in a space today where you're really trying to save a relationship or sustain a relationship, but there are just some things that are happening in that relationship that you can't continue to be a part of, then I would encourage you to really ask yourself what boundaries need to be set, to really ask yourself why you're setting those boundaries. So make sure that you reach out to me on all my social media sites. You can DM me there. Make sure you follow this channel and subscribe for more videos. And if this video helped you, remember that knowledge gained and kept to yourself is selfish, but knowledge gained and shared with other people may just be what they need to break free from the bondage that they're experiencing today and to live a life of freedom. If that's you, please like and subscribe to this channel. And if it's you, but you also know some other people, please share this video with them so that we may help them break free from the bondage that they're experiencing. I appreciate you guys for listening, and I'll see you again next time.